Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to do a drawing of a swan on a river, and I'm going to use Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils on the UART 800 paper, but first I'm going to tone the paper. So I'm toning the paper with some blue watercolor, and this paper is suitable for working with both pastels and colored pencils and other media as well. But one of the good things about it is also that you can tone it or create an underpainting that is more similar to the color that is going to dominate in your own drawing. So in my case, I need some bluish tones, and I'm using like a middle phthalo blue color. And like I said, this paper takes watercolor really well, and there will still be some tooth left to work with. So once that's dry, and it has to be dry of course, I'm going to start working with my colored pencils. The size of the paper is around 7 × 9 inches or so, and because once this dried, it turned out to be a little bit lighter than I expected, which is fine because I planned to work over it anyway. So once that was dry, I started working with these darker blue colors. I'm going to be using this helio blue reddish color, and once I apply that, as you can see, I blend with a brush to make it a little bit more even and to remove some of those lines and that texture. In some places I will use even darker colors like an indigo blue or something even darker than that, as you will see. But my main idea is to use darker blues to modify the overall color, to make it a little bit of a darker blue than my underpainting. Now I'm going to do a quick sketch with a white pencil, and you may be wondering, well, if the target color is going to be different than the color you created by toning, why did you bother with it? Well, because it's easier for me to overcome that mid-tone blue than it would be to overcome the light sand color. So when you're toning with watercolor, you don't have to achieve the exact same color that you need. You just need something that is close to the colors that you'll have in your drawing, because that way it's a lot easier to overcome the background color with colored pencils, because as you know, colored pencils are kind of slow to work with and they don't cover large areas very quickly. But here, as you can see, because the background is already blue, I just need to make it a little bit darker and a slightly different hue, and it's actually going pretty fast, as you can see. So I do a little bit of work with a pencil, and then I blend with a brush. I use a stiff bristle brush, and it kind of pushes that pigment into those lighter spaces where the pencil didn't get in, and I achieve a relatively smooth, slightly darker bluish background, as you can see. Of course, it's not going to be that simple, because I'm going to need to add a lot more detail to the water. The water is a moving surface, so there are ripples and stuff like that in it, and reflections as well. So I'm going to put some darker colors in there. I'm using a Prussian blue for the darker details, and this light phthalo blue for the lighter reflections. We don't really know what these reflections are supposed to represent. The scene probably takes place on a river near some trees on a riverbank. Maybe these reflections are reflections of those trees or bushes or whatever. So we're going to have a combination of some darker shapes and some lighter shapes, and all of these shapes will be broken into these smaller shapes because of the ripples. Now, as you can see, I'm starting to work on the swan. My initial sketch wasn't perfect, obviously, but I will refine its shape gradually as I go along. I'm starting to work with a black colored pencil, working on some of these darker details around the eye and the beak. There's a little bit of that here on the lower side of the beak as well. For the top part, I'm going to use some slightly lighter and warmer colors. I used light beige red and even a little bit of orange. This is cadmium orange, because that part of the beak is a little bit more orangey. And then the top part is a bit lighter because it's facing up towards the light source. The contrast between the lighter parts of the swan's body and the darker parts, or the shadow parts, will be extremely important here, because that way we'll be able to describe the shape of the swan's body. Anyway, as you can see, I'm continuing to work with a white pencil, drawing the top of the head here, and the top of the head is almost completely white because it's facing up, it's fully exposed to the light source. So those are some of the lightest details that I'm going to be drawing. This cheek area and the side of the head and the neck here to the right is going to be a little bit darker, so I'm using a light phthalo blue for the shadow color. So you can see I've already established a subtle contrast between the top of the head and the side of the head, because the top part is turning towards the light source, whereas the side is facing away from the light source. So it needs to be a little bit darker. So that's a nice shadow color there, but now I'm continuing to work on the background, covering more of that background with that darker blue. It's also important for me to go around the edges of the swan's body carefully so that I could create clean edges to value around the main subject. I can't leave those edges blurry or undefined. So once I cover that with a pencil, I always soften it a little bit with a brush. And now I'm just refining the outer edge of the swan's head a little bit more with a white pencil, making it a little bit brighter. I'm also cleaning up the edge using the middle phthalo blue to shave down some of the shapes that are maybe a little bit too big or need to be made a bit smoother. And that's the way I achieve a clean edge to value between the main subject and the background. Here I'm back to using that Prussian blue, a really dark blue, to draw some of those darker ripples in the water. And I'm drawing these horizontal shapes which are sometimes overlapping, sometimes not. And some of them are a little bit larger, others a little bit smaller. And because whenever I use a darker color, it creates a little bit of texture and some of those lines can look ugly. I go over that with a middle phthalo blue, which is a lighter pencil, and soften them a little bit. On top of that, I use a light phthalo blue, which is even lighter for some of these brightest reflections. I'm continuing to work on the swan, drawing the shadow side of the neck using blue colors. I used the middle phthalo blue, and now I'm using some more of the Prussian blue, because you can see that one part of the head and the neck is a lot darker than the rest. That's probably the part which is further away from the light source, or which is completely facing away from the light source. So that needs to be the darkest. This part of the neck area, which is facing to the left, is completely illuminated, so it needs to be almost white or completely white. And you can see how roughly around the middle of the neck we can see that transition between the light side of the neck and the shadow side of the neck. So you can see that the light is coming from above, but also more from the left side. So the right side of the neck is the shadow side. Now I'm drawing the rest of the body here, and you can see that this part of the body is also exposed to the light source, so it's very bright, it's a very light color, and it makes for a very nice contrast with the neck. The neck now stands out nicely against the rest of the body. Here I'm continuing to draw the tail, which should stand out nicely against the darker background. By the way, I said that I'm using the Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, but the white pencil I'm using is the Kohinoor white pencil, because I don't really have any more of the Faber-Castell white pencils, so when I run out of a certain color I will simply switch to a different brand. So here I established a contrast between the light side and the shadow side of the body. The side of the body here is a little bit darker, but not too dark. It's kind of a light bluish color. And there is also some variation in there as well. You can see that here around the tip of the wings it's a little bit darker. So I'm going in with a Prussian blue to add some even darker details there. And I'm softening that every now and then with some lighter blues. And now I have to talk about that a little bit, because one of the most efficient and the best looking ways of blending on this paper is actually by layering pencils, especially layering lighter pencils on top of the darker ones. This UART 800 paper has a bit of a rough tooth for colored pencil, I suppose, and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to achieve smooth gradients, smooth transitions, but the best way in my experience so far to do it is to apply a darker pencil first, or a darker color, darker value first, and then go on top of that with a lighter pencil. That kind of muddies the color, softens it a little bit, and blends it very nicely, removing a lot of the unwanted texture. So I want some of these feathers to look smoother, which is why I apply darker blues first, and then I apply lighter blues or even some white pencil on top of that later. But you can see that here there are some very subtle transitions between areas which are almost completely white and those which are very light blue. I'm drawing the rest I'm drawing the reflection now, actually, starting with the neck. And you can see that I'm drawing these wiggly lines, irregular looking lines. That's because the shape of the reflected image will be kind of irregular and distorted by the movement of the water. So it's important to capture those ripples in the water so that we could be able to convey to the viewer what kind of a scene they're looking at. They're looking at a scene that takes place on the water. And colors are not enough. We also need shapes to create those suggestions of the movement of the water. But first I have to focus on the colors. Of course, I'm covering the rest of the background here to the bottom on the left side, and then blending with a brush. Whenever I blend with a brush, I make it smoother, but I also retain that darker color that I've applied. I'm putting in some darker details, darker reflections in the water, and I'm creating these wiggly vertical shapes now. Again, these are just suggestions of reflections of some things that are nearby. We don't really know what those are, and we don't really need to know. We don't have to define them exactly in terms of shape. Like I said, these are probably some darker reflections of some nearby trees or something like that. I'm also putting in some lighter ripples and waves here around the swan's body to suggest the movement of the water around the bird. And also here and there in this darker area to create some additional contrast. Here I'm starting to work on the reflection by using more of the white pencil. And as you can see, I'm creating that irregular looking edge. And the head is particularly distorted. The reflection of the head is particularly distorted. And there's another interesting thing going on here, other than the fact that the shape is completely different. I'm going to put in a little bit of black color as well. But another thing that you can see is that the reflection is also a lot more bluish than the real thing. And we can't even see those orangey tones on the beak. Everything is kind of bluish. I mean, the whole scene is rather bluish, but the reflection is a little bit darker in value, and it's also more bluish in terms of color. So I'm going to try to capture that same atmosphere and that same those same colors of the environment, as well as the way the environment influences the colors on the main subject and its reflection. So I'm drawing the shadow side of the reflection now, doing some shading with middle phthalo blue. So I'm using a full range, not a full range, but I'm using quite a number of blue pencils, as you can see. The lightest one that I'm using is the light phthalo blue. I'm saving that for some of the brightest ripples and the brightest reflections in the water. And as a blending tool and as a mid-tone color, I'm using this middle phthalo blue because it's somewhere in between. It's a little bit lighter than the darker blue, so I can use it to blend and soften some of the textures and shapes, but it can also be used to draw some of the ripples that are a little bit lighter but not quite as bright as some of the lightest ones. There's a little bit more shadow here at the bottom of the body, separating the swan's body from the reflection, and I'm drawing that with a Prussian blue, so that's a little bit darker. I'm going to soften it a little bit with a middle phthalo blue, and then I'm continuing to work on the rest of the background, again using that darker blue. Like I said, it's a helio blue reddish, or whatever its name is. It's called reddish because it has more of a reddish component to it. And here I decided to use some black pencil to make some parts of the water even darker. I realized that I'm not getting enough contrast and that some of these dark blues aren't dark enough, so I put in some black and then blended that with the blue. And even though it looks a little bit ugly now, I think it's a lot closer to what I'm trying to achieve. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, but this time maybe not as large, maybe some smaller shapes. And every now and then, because that black pencil will create some texture, I will go over it and soften that with a mid-tone blue. I'm putting in some more of those darker reflections here at the top on the right side as well. And I'm drawing these as interrupted shapes, kind of stretching vertically from top to bottom. These are some reflections from the trees on the other side of the river. And I'm going over the black with a dark blue to better integrate those darker shapes into the rest of that bluish surface of the water. I'm adding a little bit more of that on the other side as well. And now, as you can see, as I'm starting to introduce these darker ripples, these darker reflections, I'm actually achieving a lot more contrast, and I think I'm able to make the surface of the water look a lot more realistic, because now those ripples in the water are a lot more noticeable, a lot more conspicuous. I'm putting some lighter ripples now with light phthalo blue. So as you can see, I've largely reworked the top part of the scene, which I initially thought that it was already done, but then I realized that I need a little bit more contrast. The lower part of the scene is a little bit darker, so I would be making that darker anyway, but I decided to add a bit more of those darker shapes at the top as well, just for the sake of balance, but also to create more contrast between the lighter and the darker ripples and the lighter and the darker reflections. I'm refining the lower part of the scene by putting in some more of these darker ripples. Right now some of them look a little bit ugly. I'm going to soften them with a dark blue pencil again. And you can see that as I go over the black with a dark blue, it becomes better integrated into the rest of the scene. There were also some lines and some texture here on the reflection. I wanted to soften that, so I'm going over that with some blue, but in some parts of the reflection I need even more value, because in order to make a convincing looking reflection you need to match the values above the water with the values on the reflection. It doesn't have to be perfect, because after all the reflection itself is rather distorted because of the movement of the water. And you can see how I made those distorted shapes around the body, the tail, the head. The whole reflection looks like it's moving a little bit because of the movement of the water. I'm adding some more of those darker ripples in the water using a black pencil. And then refining that with a middle phthalo blue, just breaking up those darker shapes every now and then with some lighter ripples, because as the water is moving, some parts of that rippling surface are facing towards the light source, others are facing away. Some of them are reflecting a little bit of those darker shapes, others are reflecting a little bit of the lighter shapes. And also I just want to soften the textures here and there, because the surface of the water looks a little bit smoother, so I can't leave these rough lines or rough textures in there. So I'm going back and forth between using lighter pencils and darker pencils, just softening a little bit here at the bottom. And now I'm done. I put my signature in the lower right corner. This is the finished drawing. Thanks for watching. Check out my other videos and give me a like. But if you want to see full-length narrated videos, check out my Patreon. Bye bye.